In the small, warm city of Verona, in the north of old Italy, there lived, 400 years ago, two great families whose enmity had begun so long before that neither of them, by the time this story begins, could quite remember what had started it. They were called the Montagues and the Capulets. They lived in two large stone houses on opposite sides of the city, with two dark walled gardens, two long lines of hired servants, and two proud old fathers who had inherited their grievance the way other men inherited land. The servants of the two houses could not pass each other in the narrow streets without small brawls, and the small brawls had, in the years leading up to this story, cost several lives. The prince of the city had grown tired of it. He had, on the morning this story begins, declared publicly that the next Montague or Capulet to draw a sword in the streets of Verona would be put to death, no matter his rank or the length of his name. That same evening, a masked ball was to be held at the great stone house of the Capulets, in honor of the family's only daughter, a girl of not yet 14 whose name was Juliet, who was thought by her parents to be nearly old enough for a small, careful marriage. They had already begun to plan for her with a warm young nobleman named Paris. Meanwhile, at the house of the Montagues, the family's only son, a young man of 19 named Romeo, was quietly heartbroken over a girl named Rosaline who had refused, gently, to marry him. His two closest friends, a warm cousin named Benvolio and a laughing, quick-tongued young nobleman named Mercutio, decided that the cure for his sadness was a small mischief. They persuaded him to put on a mask and to attend, in disguise, the very Capulet ball at which the boy's own name would have earned him a knife between the ribs if it had been known. Romeo agreed, more to please his friends than himself. He put on his mask. He walked with them through the small evening streets into the enemy's house. He saw Juliet across the room. She was standing by a small stone column in a pale dress, laughing at something one of her cousins had said. He forgot, on the instant, the girl whose refusal had been breaking his heart for weeks. He walked toward her without any plan. He spoke to her, she spoke back. They exchanged in the corner of the room 4 small warm sentences and 1 small careful kiss. Neither of them at that moment knew who the other was. They found out within the hour. Juliet's cousin, a hot-tempered young man named Tybalt, had recognized Romeo through his mask and had almost drawn a sword on him then and there. Only the intervention of Juliet's father, who did not wish blood spilled at his daughter's ball, had prevented a fight. Romeo left quickly. Juliet, when her nurse told her whose son the masked stranger had been, was silent for a long moment. Then she said in a small, warm voice that if she could not marry him, she would marry no one. Romeo, unable to leave the walled garden of the Capulet house that night, climbed a small stone wall and stood beneath Juliet's balcony. She came out to lean on the railing. She spoke softly to the moon, believing herself to be alone. She said Romeo's name. She said it as though the name itself were a small warm thing she wished she could keep. He stepped out from below. She was startled. He climbed up. They talked in the small dark hour before dawn, and by the time the birds began to sing they had promised each other everything. The next morning Romeo went to a warm, careful old priest named Friar Lawrence who had known him since he was a boy. He asked the friar to marry them in secret that same afternoon. The friar hesitated. He was afraid. But he also believed, quietly, that the marriage of the two young people might, in time, become a small bridge between the two feuding houses. So he agreed. He married them in the small, warm chapel behind his monastery that afternoon. Only Juliet's nurse was there to witness. That same afternoon, in the small hot streets of Verona, the trouble that had been waiting for many years finally came. Tybalt, still furious at Romeo's presence at the Capulet ball, found him in the street and challenged him to a fight. Romeo, who had that very morning become Tybalt's cousin by marriage, refused. He tried to explain, gently, that he loved Tybalt now, though Tybalt did not understand why. Mercutio, who did not know about the secret marriage and who was ashamed of what he thought was his friend's cowardice, drew his own sword and fought Tybalt in Romeo's place. Tybalt, in a small, quick moment, thrust his sword under Mercutio's arm and killed him. Mercutio died in Romeo's arms in a small, dark doorway. Romeo, who loved him more than anyone in the world after Juliet, went half mad with grief. When Tybalt returned to the street a few minutes later, Romeo drew his own sword. In the small, terrible fight that followed, Romeo killed Tybalt. The prince of the city came to the scene that same evening. He remembered his own words of the morning before. He did not have Romeo put to death. but he banished him from Verona on pain of death if he ever returned, and he ordered him to leave for the small nearby city of Mantua that very night. Romeo climbed the balcony one last time. He and Juliet spent a small, quiet hour together in the dawn before he left. He promised he would send for her. He climbed down the way he had come up. He rode to Mantua. The following morning, Juliet's father, who did not know that his daughter was already married, announced that her wedding to Paris would take place in 3 days. Juliet, in terror, ran to the friar. The friar, who had grown afraid of the small bad situation he had helped to make, offered her a small desperate plan. He gave her a small vial of a dark drink he had prepared himself. If she drank it on the eve of her wedding, she would fall into a deep sleep so like death that even her own family would believe she had died. She would be laid in the family tomb. He would send word to Romeo. Romeo would come from Mantua on the appointed night, would meet her at the tomb when she woke, and would carry her away with him. Juliet took the small vial. She went home. She agreed calmly to the wedding. She drank the drink the night before the wedding was to be held. She fell into the deep sleep the friar had promised. Her family found her at dawn, wept for her as though she had died, and laid her, that same afternoon, in the great stone tomb of the Capulet family. The friar sent a small, trusted young monk with a letter to Romeo in Mantua. But there was a plague in one of the small villages between Verona and Mantua, and the young monk was stopped at the gates of that village and held there for many days by the guards, who feared he had brought the plague with him. The letter never reached Romeo. Instead, one of Romeo's own servants, who had been in Verona and had seen Juliet carried into the tomb, rode to Mantua and told his master, weeping, that his young wife was dead. Romeo said nothing for a long moment. Then he stood up. He went to a small poor apothecary he had noticed some days earlier in Mantua. He bought, for a small handful of gold, a small vial of poison strong enough to kill 20 men. He rode back to Verona that night. He arrived at the Capulet tomb at midnight. Paris, who had come to grieve, was there before him. They fought in the small, dark space in front of the tomb. Romeo killed Paris. He carried the young man's body inside and laid him gently beside the small, still figure of Juliet, because he did not wish to leave him alone in the dark. He looked at Juliet for a long moment. She did not look dead to him. She looked warm and calm and almost as though she were about to open her eyes and speak to him. He did not understand. He did not know what he was seeing. He kissed her gently on the forehead. He took the small vial from his coat. He drank it. He lay down beside her. He was dead within minutes. Juliet woke perhaps half an hour later. She sat up slowly in the tomb. She saw Romeo beside her. She understood in one small, terrible moment exactly what had happened. She took the small dagger from his belt. She put it into her own heart in one small, quick movement and fell forward across him and died. The friar arrived at the tomb minutes later. So did the prince who had been called to the scene. So did the fathers of both houses. The 2 old men, who had spent their whole lives hating each other for a reason neither of them could remember, stood in the small, dark tomb over the small, still bodies of their 2 children. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Then quietly they took each other's hands. The feud, which had been fed for so many years on so many small grudges, ended in that small, dark tomb, on that small, dark morning, over the small, warm bodies of 2 children who had loved each other more than either of the fathers had ever known how to love anyone in their whole long lives. There was no more fighting in the streets of Verona after that. But there was, in the years that followed, in the small, quiet gardens of both great houses,